Darius Warren maneuvered his cart down the grocery aisle, a quiet satisfaction settling over him as he scanned the shelves. The hum of conversation around him and the soft music overhead blended into a calming rhythm he rarely had time to enjoy. Days off were precious, time to unwind, shed the weight of his badge, and just be a face in the crowd. He reached for a carton of milk and tossed it into his cart, savoring the small, ordinary moment. But just as he moved to check a shopping list, a sharp, biting voice cut through the store's comfortable murmur, slicing the air like a knife. "What do you think you're doing?" Darius turned, his attention drawn to the front registers, where he saw a white man in a scuffed leather jacket towering over a young black cashier. Even from a distance, Darius recognized the man, Tom Langston, a fellow officer with a reputation as prickly as his demeanor. Darius had seen him around enough to know that Tom was more than just prickly. He was the type who thrived on his authority. A man who wore his badge as a weapon, even when it wasn't visible. The cashier, barely old enough to look legal, seemed to shrink under Tom's scrutiny. His face flushed as he stammered. I didn't do anything wrong, sir." Tom leaned closer, his voice thick with disdain. "Don't play dumb. I saw you slip something under the counter. You thought I wouldn't notice?" The boy's face reddened further, his eyes darting around in desperation as he looked for anyone, to help. Shoppers nearby shifted uncomfortably, some murmuring, others averting their eyes. Darius could feel the tension radiating from the scene, the unspoken agreement among bystanders that this was not their fight. Darius tightened his grip on the cart handle, watching as Tom's accusations grew louder, harsher, filling the aisles with echoes of judgment. He could see it, the power play, the way Tom's stance projected his authority and threatened anyone who dared question him. As Darius took a steady breath, he released his cart and stepped forward, his presence calm but unyielding. "Hey, everything all right here?" Tom's head whipped around, his eyes narrowing as he took in Darius's familiar face. For a moment, recognition flashed, and a scowl settled on his expression. "This kid here thinks he can get away with stealing." Tom sneered, jerking a thumb at the cashier. "Not on my watch." Darius met his gaze evenly. "That's a serious accusation for just grocery shopping. What's your proof?" Tom's jaw tightened as he looked Darius up and down. "And you are just another shopper? Just a customer wondering why a simple grocery run has turned into a scene." Darius replied, his tone smooth and unwavering. The young cashier shot Darius a grateful, albeit shaky, "Look, I didn't take anything, sir. He just started yelling at me." Tom scoffed, crossing his arms as he looked back at the cashier. "Oh, so now you're calling me a liar?" Darius could feel the frustration simmering beneath his calm demeanor. It's strange to accuse someone without proof, especially in a public place like this. Seems like it could get messy. Tom's eyes darkened, but a flicker of doubt crept into his expression. The authority he wielded so effortlessly now met the silent resistance of another authority, one not about intimidation, but principle. After a tense pause, Tom stepped back, a reluctant glare directed at the cashier. "Lucky break, kid," he muttered. "Better watch yourself." With one last bitter look at Darius, Tom stalked off toward the exit, his footsteps pounding against the floor as he retreated. The cashier exhaled a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping with relief. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought." Darius shook his head, giving the young man a reassuring nod. "No need to thank me. Just stand your ground. All right?" The boy managed a faint smile, nodding as he returned to his station. Darius watched as Tom disappeared into the parking lot, a surge of anger simmering just below his composed surface. He knew that Tom's behavior wasn't just a momentary lapse, it was part of a pattern, one that he'd seen too many times. And as he walked toward the exit, he realized that this was far from over. Some lines, once crossed, couldn't be ignored. Darius Warren felt the weight of eyes on him the moment he stepped through the precinct doors. It wasn't just another day at the station. Conversations halted as he passed by, and a trail of whispers trailed him through the hallway like smoke. Darius was used to attention, but today, it felt sharper, more pointed, as though each glance was slicing at his back. He hadn't expected his confrontation with Tom Langston to go unnoticed, but he also hadn't anticipated the ripple of tension it would send through the precinct. Tom was one of them, part of the Brotherhood, and Darius knew there were those who would see his actions as betrayal. As he made his way down the hallway, he caught the occasional sideways glance, the faint murmur of judgment in his wake. Still, he kept his head high, reminding himself that what he'd done had been right, no matter how uncomfortable that truth might be for others. Just as he reached his desk, a message from Captain Julia Hardy's office flashed across his screen. "Report to my office immediately." Darius took a steadying breath and headed toward her door, steeling himself for whatever came next. Captain Hardy sat behind her desk, her gaze unreadable as she gestured for him to take a seat. She had an air of quiet authority, a presence that could command a room without a word. As he settled into the chair, she folded her hands in front of her, studying him with a look that was both appraising and cautious. "Warren," she began, her voice steady. "I heard about the incident this morning." She paused, letting her words hang in the air before continuing. "You arrested Officer Langston?" Darius nodded, meeting her gaze without wavering. "Yes, Captain. He was out of line, harassing a young cashier without cause. I intervened, and when he refused to back down, he escalated it into an assault." Captain Hardy watched him in silence for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Did you know who he was when you intervened?" "No, ma'am," Darius replied. "I recognized him after the confrontation started, but by then, he'd already crossed the line." Her expression softened, and she leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers thoughtfully on the desk. "Langston has a history. There have been complaints, but nothing anyone could pin down." She studied him carefully. "Until now." Darius felt a flicker of hope at her words, but held his response, waiting for her to continue. "However," she went on, her tone shifting, "you should know there are some who won't see it that way. Langston has friends, allies who feel that you overstepped." She sighed, her gaze steady. "You've stirred something up, Warren. This isn't just about Langston anymore. It's about how the department deals with its own." Darius braced himself, nodding. "I understand, Captain. But if we can't hold each other accountable, what are we doing here?" Captain Hardy's mouth quirked, a shadow of approval flashing in her eyes. "That's the right answer, Warren." She leaned forward, her voice dropping slightly. "But be careful. There's a difference between what's right and what's easy. You've chosen the hard road, and not everyone will be in your corner." A silence stretched between them, laden with the unspoken implications of her words. Darius knew exactly what she meant. In a world where the thin blue line often meant looking the other way, he had chosen to stand his ground. But he also knew that decision came with a cost. She finally broke the silence, her voice thoughtful. "For what it's worth, you have my support, but tread carefully. Some of the old guard, they see any challenge to the status quo as a threat. They'll try to undermine you if they can." Darius nodded, a surge of gratitude mixed with resolve rising in his chest. "I appreciate that, Captain. I'll be ready for whatever comes." Captain Hardy gave a slow nod, respect evident in her gaze. "Good. Now get back out there. The precinct's watching. Warren, make sure you give them something to see." As he left her office, Darius felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead might be treacherous, but he knew he wasn't alone. He would face the fallout, endure the whispers, and hold his ground because standing for what was right was worth any storm. Darius entered the precinct the next morning, feeling the weight of every glance that came his way. Conversations halted mid-sentence, and people turned, their gazes sharp with unspoken judgment. Whispers seemed to hum through the air like static, a constant reminder of his decision to arrest Officer Tom Langston, a decision that had become the talk of the precinct. He moved through the hall with steady steps, his expression calm. But inside, he felt the rift growing. Some officers had given him a nod of respect, subtle but meaningful, as though to say, "We're with you." Others, though, offered only cold looks, their eyes flicking to him with barely disguised resentment. He hadn't expected gratitude, but the hostility was thicker than he'd anticipated, a tension that seemed to vibrate with every step he took. As he entered the break room, the atmosphere shifted, charged with something unsaid. Officers clustered around tables, their conversations hushed as they cast furtive glances his way. Darius ignored them, grabbing a cup of coffee and heading toward the door. But a figure stepped into his path, Officer Paulson, a middle-aged cop with a reputation for loyalty to his own and a gaze as steely as his jaw. "So," Paulson began, his voice low and challenging, "you're the one who decided to haul Langston in." His arms folded across his chest, and he leaned back against the counter, his expression a mix of curiosity and accusation. Darius met his gaze without flinching. "I didn't decide anything, Paulson. Langston made that choice when he crossed the line." A murmur rippled through the room, officers exchanging uneasy glances. Paulson's mouth twitched, a hint of a smirk playing at the corners. Crossed the line or just handled a situation in his own way. Some of us don't go around arresting fellow cops over a misunderstanding. Darius felt his patience thinning but kept his tone steady. A misunderstanding? He harassed a kid without cause, then threw a punch when I didn't back down. That's not a misunderstanding, Paulson. That's abuse of power. Paulson scoffed, the smirk never leaving his face. Langston's been doing this job a long time. He knows what he's doing. That doesn't give him the right to bully people. Darius replied, his voice cold. We're here to protect the community, not to lord over it. You know that. A few nearby officers had stopped their conversations, watching the exchange with interest. Darius noticed Officer Blake, a young cop with a nervous expression, whispering something under his breath. Here we go. The tension in the room thickened as Paulson leaned closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You think you're going to change the system by arresting one cop? You think dragging him down is going to make you some kind of hero? Darius held his ground, his gaze steady. I'm not trying to be a hero, Paulson. I'm doing what's right. And if that means standing up to someone who abuses their authority, I'll do it. Paulson's eyes narrowed, a dark glint of warning flashing in them. Watch yourself, Warren. You might think you're on the high road, but not everyone here is on your side. With that, Paulson turned and walked out, leaving Darius alone in the charged silence of the break room. The remaining officers exchanged uneasy glances before dispersing, their expressions a mixture of unease and quiet disapproval. Darius felt the weight of the room's judgment settle over him, a stark reminder of the uphill battle he was facing. Later that day, Darius was called into Captain Hardy's office. He could tell from the look on her face that this wasn't just a routine check-in. She gestured for him to sit, her expression carefully controlled as she regarded him across the desk. Warren, she began, her voice measured. It seems word has spread fast about your confrontation with Langston. Not just here, but over at the 8th Precinct as well. She sighed, folding her hands on the desk. They're not exactly pleased with how this went down. Darius nodded, his expression unwavering. I expected some pushback, Captain. Her gaze sharpened, concern flickering behind her eyes. There are those who feel you overstepped. Warren, Langston has connections, and they're questioning your judgment, saying you could have handled it differently. Darius could feel a spark of frustration, but kept his voice even. Handled it differently. Captain? By turning a blind eye? By letting him get away with assault? He put me in a position where there was no choice. Captain Hardy raised a hand, her face lined with worry. I get it, Darius. But this is about more than just your choice. It's about how it's affecting the department. There's going to be an internal review, and I don't want you blindsided by it. An internal review. Darius's jaw tightened, though he kept his voice calm. They're reviewing me? Not him. Hardy nodded, her gaze steady. Both of you. Langston's record and past complaints are being looked into. But they're also scrutinizing your actions, every step of it. They want to know if protocol was followed. Darius forced himself to remain composed, though a part of him burned with indignation. I followed procedure. Captain. By the book. I believe you. Hardy replied quietly. But others, they might look for reasons to discredit you. To paint this as a personal vendetta instead of a necessary action. Just be ready for that. Darius took a deep breath, letting the reality of her words sink in. He'd known there would be backlash, but hearing about the internal review made the stakes feel even higher. It wasn't just about doing what was right anymore, it was about defending his actions against a system that often protected its own. I understand.
Captain, he said,
his voice steady. I'll be ready. Captain Hardy gave him a nod, a glimmer of respect in her eyes. Good. For what it's worth, you have my support. But be careful. Warren, people are watching. As he left her office, Darius felt a new weight settle over him. He'd made a choice that had shaken things up. And now he was facing the full force of a system that didn't always reward those who challenged it. But he also knew he couldn't turn back. He'd started down this path for a reason, and he was prepared to see it through, no matter what came next. Darius was steeling himself for another day under scrutinizing gazes when he received an unexpected message. Report to the conference room immediately. The summons was from Captain Hardy, but the way it was worded hinted that something or someone bigger was involved. His gut tightened as he made his way down the hall, conscious of the glances thrown his way by officers who sensed that something serious was brewing. When he stepped into the conference room, Darius felt the charged atmosphere hit him instantly. Captain Hardy was there, standing off to one side, her expression tense yet unreadable. Several officers from his precinct had gathered, along with a handful of unfamiliar faces, likely from the 8th Precinct. And at the head of the table stood a figure that demanded attention, Chief Alan Montgomery. Chief Montgomery's presence wasn't common at precinct meetings. With nearly 3 decades on the force, he was known for his even-handedness and stern approach, a reputation that commanded respect. If the chief himself had come down to address this, it was more than just a routine meeting, it was a reckoning. Take a seat. Officer Warren, Chief Montgomery said, gesturing to an empty chair near Captain Hardy. Darius nodded and complied, feeling the weight of the chief's gaze settle over him as he sat. Across the table, Tom Langston sat rigidly, his face a mix of defiance and discomfort, his jaw clenched tight. Chief Montgomery's eyes swept over the room, a flash of disapproval visible as he observed the tension simmering among his officers. It's come to my attention, he began, his voice low but powerful, that we have a serious divide in this department. A divide that, if left unchecked, threatens not only the morale of this precinct, but the integrity of the entire force. He let his words hang in the air, the silence thick and heavy. Then his gaze shifted to Darius and Tom, his eyes sharp and unforgiving. The incident between officers Warren and Langston has exposed issues we cannot ignore. This isn't just about an arrest or a disagreement. It's about how we conduct ourselves, how we uphold the standards we're sworn to defend. Darius noticed Tom shift uncomfortably, glancing around as if seeking support, but the chief's voice cut through any chance of escape. I've read both of your reports. Chief Montgomery continued, and I've spoken with Captain Hardy and Langston's commanding officer over at the 8th Precinct. I've also reviewed the security footage from the grocery store. Based on what I've seen, it's clear that Officer Langston acted outside of protocol. The room was silent as Montgomery's gaze fixed on Tom, his voice hardening. You accused a civilian without evidence, escalated the situation unnecessarily, and then assaulted another officer when he stepped in to de-escalate. That behavior is not only unprofessional, it's a direct violation of the standards we stand for. A murmur rippled through the room. Tom's face flushed, his eyes flicking toward the table. But he held his tongue, likely realizing that any outburst now would only worsen his situation. Chief Montgomery's tone softened slightly as he turned to Darius, though his expression remained serious. Officer Warren, you stepped in with the intention of maintaining order. I understand the difficult position you were put in, and while I commend your integrity, the way this incident played out has left this department divided. The chief took a measured breath, his gaze shifting back and forth between Darius and Tom. This department cannot function if our officers are at each other's throats. We can't operate as separate factions, divided by precinct lines or by loyalty to individuals. We have to be united under a common purpose.
He paused,
His voice firm as he addressed Tom directly. Officer Langston, effective immediately. You're officially reprimanded and placed on mandatory training and counseling. The complaints against you will be reviewed, and any further issues will result in disciplinary action. This is your chance to prove that you're willing to adapt and work within the values we stand for. Tom's face turned a shade darker. His jaw clenched, but he nodded, the resentment in his eyes barely contained. Darius could see that this reprimand felt like a heavy blow to a man who had coasted on the privileges of his badge for far too long. Chief Montgomery then turned to Darius, his expression unreadable. Officer Warren, I respect your commitment to upholding the integrity of this department, but I need you to remember that every action has consequences, not just for you, but for everyone here. I want you to attend a mediation session with Officer Langston. This isn't a punishment. It's a step toward rebuilding trust. Darius nodded, suppressing the urge to argue. He understood the chief's message. Accountability was necessary, but unity was essential for survival in a profession that required both. As much as Darius wanted to distance himself from officers like Tom, he realized that a broken department would serve no one, not the community, and not the officers who genuinely sought to protect and serve. Chief Montgomery scanned the room, his gaze hardening. I'm calling on each of you to support the values we claim to uphold: respect, integrity, and fairness. This department is a family, and like any family, we have issues to work through. You may not agree with every decision made here, but I expect every one of you to commit to this department without letting personal biases cloud your judgment. He let his words sink in, his expression unyielding. Officer Langston, it's time for a change. Officer Warren, I trust you'll continue to hold yourself to the high standards you demonstrated that day. And to everyone else in this room, remember, we're one team. Any division ends today. A thick silence filled the room as his final words resonated. Tom's face was a mix of embarrassment and anger, and Darius could feel the tension radiating from him. But as the chief's piercing gaze lingered, Tom kept silent, the reprimand hitting harder than any argument. With a final nod, Chief Montgomery dismissed the room, officers slowly filing out in quiet murmurs. A few officers shot Darius a quick look of respect, others averted their eyes, still hesitant. As Darius moved to leave, he felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Captain Hardy, her expression softer than usual, a faint smile of approval gracing her face. You handled yourself well, Warren, she said, her voice low. This wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Darius returned her look with a nod. Thank you,
Captain.
I know this is just the beginning. She gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. You're right. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it's officers like you who make it possible. Across the room, he caught Tom lingering near the doorway, his cold stare unwavering, as if promising that this wasn't over. But Darius knew that,
too.
The resentment wasn't going to disappear overnight.
Still,
he felt a quiet resolve as he walked past Tom, feeling the weight of his decisions settle over him with clarity. It was a long road ahead, but standing up for what was right was worth every step, and he was ready to take them, one by one, no matter who tried to block his path. The sun was beginning to set as Darius left the precinct, the shadows lengthening over the parking lot. The day had been grueling, but he felt a new sense of purpose after the chief's intervention.
For the first time,
he felt that perhaps his actions might spark some change, that standing up to Tom Langston's abuse of power could lead to a ripple effect within the department. He had just unlocked his car door when he heard footsteps approaching from behind. Quick and determined. Darius turned, his hand instinctively hovering near his badge, though he stopped short when he saw who it was. Tom Langston was striding toward him, his face twisted in a scowl. His eyes narrowed with a barely concealed rage. "You think you've won, don't you?" Tom's voice was low, his tone venomous. He took another step forward, stopping just a few feet from Darius. "You think humiliating me in front of the whole department, getting the chief to slap me with a reprimand, makes you some kind of hero?" Darius met his gaze, unflinching, his voice calm. "This isn't about winning, Langston. It's about doing what's right. You crossed a line, and now you have to face the consequences." Tom let out a harsh, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Consequences? You think you know what that word means? You've been on this force for what, a few years? You think that's enough time to tell me how to do my job? This isn't about how long you've been here, Langston," Darius replied, keeping his tone steady. "It's about how you treat people. You think wearing a badge gives you the right to bully people and get away with it? That's not the kind of officer I signed up to be. And it's not the kind of officer I'm going to cover for." Tom's face reddened, and his fists clenched at his sides. "You don't know a damn thing about what it takes to be a cop," he spat. "I've put in years of work, dealt with more dirtbags than you'll ever see. You think you're better than me because of one arrest? Because you managed to get the chief on your side?" Darius felt his own anger flare, but he held it in check, determined not to give Tom the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. "It's not about being better than you,
Tom.
It's about holding ourselves to the standard we expect from everyone else. And that means we don't get to use our badges to intimidate people." Tom's eyes darkened, a dangerous glint appearing in them. "You're just some idealist, living in a fantasy where people like you can actually change things. But you're going to find out that this world isn't built for people like you, Warren." Darius's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "Maybe that's the difference between us. I'm willing to stand up for something, even if it's hard. And if that means challenging people like you, then I'll do it." Tom took a step closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You don't belong here, Warren. You're not one of us. And I'll make sure everyone sees that." Before Darius could respond, a voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. "That's enough, Langston." Both men turned to see Chief Montgomery standing at the edge of the parking lot, his expression stern, his gaze cold as he walked toward them. The chief had clearly been observing, his presence casting an undeniable authority over the scene. Tom's posture faltered, a flash of uncertainty crossing his face. "Chief," Tom began, forcing a weak smile as he took a step back, trying to regain composure. "I was just having a word with Warren here, trying to clear up a few misunderstandings." Chief Montgomery's gaze narrowed, unyielding. "I think we both know that's not what this is, Langston. I've seen enough."
He paused,
his voice calm but cutting. "This kind of behavior has no place in my department." Tom's face paled, his mouth opening in shock. "Chief, you can't be serious. You're taking his side? Over mine?" Chief Montgomery's eyes remained cold,
his voice firm.
"In all the years you've been with this department, you've left a trail of complaints and questionable conduct. I gave you a chance to own up to your mistakes,
to change.
But instead, here you are, threatening a fellow officer in a parking lot."
He paused,
letting his words sink in, his expression resolute. "You're done, Langston." Tom's face twisted, a mixture of rage and desperation in his eyes as he looked between Darius and the chief. "You'll regret this," he muttered, his voice a venomous whisper. "Both of you." "Enough." The chief's voice rose slightly, his authority unmistakable. "You're dismissed, effective immediately. Turn in your badge and your gun by the end of the day." Tom's fists clenched at his sides, his face contorted with fury. You can't do this," he stammered, his voice breaking. Chief Montgomery's expression was steely, You're no longer an officer, Langston. This isn't a discussion. For a moment, Tom seemed to consider lashing out, his face a storm of emotions. But finally, with a bitter, defeated laugh, he took a step back, shooting one last hateful glare at Darius before turning and stalking off into the shadows of the parking lot. As Tom's footsteps faded, the chief turned to Darius, his expression softening just slightly. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that, Warren," he said quietly. "But you did the right thing. You handled yourself well." Darius nodded, a surge of relief washing over him. "Thank you,
Chief.
I know this wasn't easy." The chief gave a small nod, a look of respect in his eyes. "No, it wasn't. But keeping people like Langston on the force only damages the values we stand for. We need officers like you, those who are willing to do the hard things." He placed a reassuring hand on Darius's shoulder, giving him a firm pat before heading back toward the station. Darius watched him go, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him as he got into his car. The battle with Langston might be over, but he knew that this was only one victory in a much larger fight for change.
Still,
As he drove home, a sense of calm and purpose filled him, knowing he'd made a difference, not just for himself, but for everyone he'd sworn to protect.
and tonight.
As he looked out over the city lights stretching into the horizon, he knew he was ready for whatever came next. The fallout from Tom Langston's dismissal was swift, sending shockwaves through the department. It wasn't just the usual water cooler gossip. The energy in the precinct was charged, each interaction crackling with the knowledge that one of their own had been removed from the force by a fellow officer's actions. In a world where loyalty to the badge was often unspoken and unbreakable, Darius's choice had challenged that code, and the result was a divide that felt almost tangible. The following day, Darius walked into the precinct under the weight of wary glances and murmured conversations. Some officers nodded at him with something like respect, while others averted their eyes, unwilling to meet his gaze. He could feel the tension with every step, the silent lines drawn between those who saw his actions as necessary and those who felt betrayed. Captain Hardy, however, didn't waste time acknowledging the shift. Within days, she had organized a series of joint training exercises between the precincts, emphasizing unity and shared purpose. She held mandatory meetings, underscoring the need for integrity, professionalism, and accountability. But even with these efforts, Darius could sense the unease among his colleagues. It was as though everyone was waiting for something, some kind of breakthrough that would finally allow the department to breathe again. During one of these training sessions, Darius found himself paired with Officer Blake, a young cop who had once looked up to Langston. Blake was quiet, his posture tense as they went through their drill, his eyes avoiding Darius's whenever they had to exchange roles in the exercise. Finally, after a particularly intense session, Blake spoke, his tone low but edged with frustration. "You know, I used to think Langston was what a good cop looked like.
Tough.
Unbending. But after what you did," he trailed off, searching for the words. "I guess I didn't realize how much fear and respect can look the same." Darius glanced at him,
Surprised.
"It takes time to see it," he said evenly. "But when you're using fear to get what you want, that's not respect. It's control." Blake nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I didn't get it at first, but maybe we needed someone to make us see things differently." He glanced at Darius, respect now shining in his eyes. "You did that, whether people want to admit it or not." Darius felt a weight lift at Blake's words, though he knew it was only a small crack in the division. Still, the exchange gave him hope that change, while slow, was possible. Later that afternoon, Darius was in Captain Hardy's office, discussing the growing tension and the response to Langston's firing. He had tried to brush off the resentment, to ignore the icy stares and the whispers. But he was beginning to realize the divide was deeper than he'd thought. "Captain," he said, choosing his words carefully, "we can't just leave this with training exercises. There's more here, something we haven't been addressing." He hesitated, then added, "Racism runs deep in this department, and I'm done pretending it doesn't. It's affecting how we treat each other and how the community sees us." Captain Hardy studied him, her gaze reflective and unguarded. "I understand, Warren," she said finally, her voice carrying a hint of weariness. "I think you're right. We've been dancing around this issue for too long, trying not to make waves." She paused, tapping her fingers thoughtfully on her desk. "But if this department is going to survive, if we're going to become better than we've been, we can't just sweep this under the rug anymore." She looked at him, a question in her eyes. "Would you be willing to bring this up with Chief Montgomery? If you're ready to push for it, I think he'll listen." Darius felt his heart beat faster, the gravity of her suggestion settling over him. He nodded, a quiet resolve building inside him.
Yes, Captain.
It's past time. That evening, Darius met with Chief Montgomery in his office, explaining his frustrations and his concerns about the department's reluctance to address racial bias head-on. The chief listened carefully, his face growing more thoughtful with each word. "Warren," Chief Montgomery said finally, his voice carrying a weight of respect. "You're right. We've allowed certain attitudes to go unchallenged for too long, and it's time for a change." He leaned back, his gaze steady. "You've taken the first step by bringing this issue forward, and I'm prepared to support you in pushing for a department that reflects the fairness we claim to uphold." The chief's words sent a wave of relief through Darius. Together, they discussed plans for implementing ongoing training focused not only on de-escalation and community engagement, but also on confronting and addressing biases within the force. On the final day of the training sessions, Chief Montgomery called everyone into the training yard. The officers gathered in a quiet crowd, murmuring amongst themselves as they speculated about what the chief might have to say. Darius stood toward the back, his heart pounding as he waited, wondering if the chief would indeed bring up the difficult conversations they'd had. When the murmuring died down, Chief Montgomery's voice rang out, steady and authoritative. "These last few days, we focused on rebuilding trust and revisiting what it means to wear this badge. But there's something I need to address today, something that goes beyond training exercises." The chief scanned the crowd, his gaze resting on Darius briefly before he continued. "Recent events have brought an issue to the surface that has been simmering for far too long. Our department, like many others, has allowed racial biases, to affect the way we treat each other and the communities we serve. And if we're going to move forward, we can't ignore this any longer." A tense silence filled the yard. Darius felt the eyes of his fellow officers shifting to him, some with surprise, others with quiet respect. Every officer here has a responsibility to recognize and confront their own biases. Chief Montgomery continued, his tone resolute. "And I have one officer in particular to thank for bringing this issue to me, Officer Warren." Darius felt his heart swell with gratitude and determination as the chief nodded toward him. The chief continued, "Officer Warren reminded me that we owe it to ourselves and the community to do better, to be better." The chief's gaze swept over the crowd. "So, starting today, we're implementing ongoing training focused on bias recognition and addressing prejudice in all its forms. This isn't a one-time effort. This is a shift in how we operate. We'll work to build a department where every person, every officer, and every member of our community is treated with respect and dignity." From the crowd, Officer Martinez from the 8th Precinct raised his hand. "Thank you,
Chief.
I think a lot of US didn't realize how deep this issue goes. And I appreciate Warren for pushing for this. It's time we took a hard look at ourselves." Chief Montgomery nodded. "That's exactly what we're going to do. Martinez, we serve our community, and we can't do that if we're unwilling to look inward first." He scanned the crowd again, his voice growing stronger. "This department will not tolerate bias of any form against our fellow officers or against our community. If you can't support that, you're not fit to wear this badge." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, but Darius could feel a shift in the atmosphere. A few officers nodded. Others murmured words of agreement. He sensed a new understanding taking hold, a collective willingness to face the hard truths that had lingered beneath the surface for too long. When the chief finished, a smattering of applause broke out, hesitant at first but growing stronger. Officers began to approach Darius afterward, some shaking his hand, others offering quiet words of gratitude and respect. Even Captain Hardy gave him an approving smile as she walked by, her eyes warm with admiration. "You did good, Warren," she said softly. "You brought this issue to the forefront. And the chief's right, it's a change that's long overdue." Darius nodded, the weight of the last few days finally lifting from his shoulders. "Thank you,
Captain.
I'm just glad we're finally facing it." As he left the training yard, Darius felt a sense of fulfillment that had been missing for a long time. He'd challenged a system that wasn't always willing to change. And in doing so, he'd sparked a transformation. It wasn't the end of the journey, but he felt certain it was the beginning of something that mattered. He was ready for whatever came next, knowing that he'd done his part to make his department and his community a better place. In the days following Chief Montgomery's announcement, a cautious optimism settled over the precinct. Officers went about their duties with a new awareness, many grappling with the chief's words and the uncomfortable truths they brought to light. But as much as Darius could sense a shift, he knew that real change wasn't guaranteed. It was fragile, its roots still shallow. Darius spent his shifts observing the dynamics within the precinct, noting the subtle changes in attitude and approach. Some officers, like Officer Blake, were openly supportive, treating him with a newfound respect. Others were reserved, their guarded stares hinting at skepticism, or even resentment, as though they felt betrayed by his stand against Tom Langston. One afternoon, as Darius was filing reports in the quiet of the break room, Captain Hardy walked in and closed the door behind her. Her expression was serious, but there was a hint of something else in her eyes, a cautious determination. "Warren," she began, sitting down across from him, "I've been meaning to speak with you about the training sessions." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We've made some strides, but I can see that it's not enough. I think you see that too." Darius nodded, meeting her gaze. "The trainings have helped, but the issues run deeper than a few workshops can fix. People are still holding on to old ways of thinking, even if they're not saying it out loud." Captain Hardy leaned forward, her voice quiet but intense. "I agree, but if we want to address this in a meaningful way, we'll need a more substantial, continuous effort. I was thinking of implementing a mentorship program, officers from different backgrounds paired together, learning directly from each other." The idea resonated with Darius. He'd seen how meaningful connections could shift perspectives, could slowly chip away at assumptions. "I think that could be powerful,
Captain.
People are more likely to change when they see things up close, when it's personal." Captain Hardy nodded, her eyes sharp with resolve. "I'll bring it up to the chief, but I'll need your help to set it up, to make sure it's something people will want to participate in." Darius felt a sense of purpose swelling within him. "You have my full support, whatever it takes. I'm in." Together, they spent the afternoon drafting a proposal for the mentorship program, envisioning how it could bring officers closer and create genuine understanding across the force. Hardy's belief in his cause strengthened Darius's resolve, making him feel that they were moving toward a future he could truly stand behind. The next day, Chief Montgomery gathered the precinct in the main hall to introduce the program. As he outlined the details, Darius could see the officers' mixed reactions. Some nodded in support, while others shifted uncomfortably, casting wary glances in his direction. But he noticed something new. There were fewer hostile looks, and the air felt less divided. When the chief finished, Darius raised his hand to speak. He took a deep breath as all eyes turned to him. "I know some of you might feel like this is too much, too fast," he began, his voice calm but firm. "But we're not just here to wear a badge. We're here to protect and serve everyone in this community, not just those we're comfortable with." We can't do that if we're divided, or if we let biases cloud our judgment.
He paused.
Letting his words settle. This program isn't about forcing anyone to change. It's about giving us a chance to understand each other, to see that we're on the same side. We're only as strong as the trust we build with each other and with the people we're sworn to protect. A murmur went through the crowd, officers glancing at one another. Darius noticed Blake and Martinez nodding, their expressions resolute. But across the room, Officer Paulson's face was tight with skepticism. Paulson crossed his arms, his voice carrying a hint of disdain as he spoke. And what happens if this doesn't work? Warren? What happens if all this understanding doesn't change anything? Darius met Paulson's gaze, unflinching. Then at least we tried, Paulson. But if we don't try, we're guaranteeing that nothing will ever change. We owe it to ourselves and to the community to give this an honest chance. Chief Montgomery stepped forward, his tone firm. This isn't optional. Every officer will participate in the program, and I expect full commitment from each of you. We're building a department where respect is more than a slogan. It's a practice. With that, the chief dismissed the meeting, and the officers began to disperse, murmuring among themselves. As Darius watched them go, he felt a quiet satisfaction. He knew the work would be hard, that the path to change was long and unpredictable. But for the first time, he felt the precinct was truly moving forward. In the days that followed, the mentorship program rolled out, pairing officers from different precincts and backgrounds, pushing them to work together on community outreach projects and patrols. Darius found himself partnered with Blake, and over time, he saw a shift in the young officer, a willingness to question things he had previously accepted without thought, a determination to hold himself accountable. One evening, after a long shift spent patrolling one of the city's rougher neighborhoods, Blake turned to Darius as they sat in the cruiser, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Warren," he said quietly, "I never really understood why you went through all this trouble.
But now,
I get it. I see what you were fighting for." Darius gave him a nod, his voice soft. "It's not easy, Blake, but that's why it matters." Blake looked down, nodding to himself. "I used to think loyalty meant standing by your partners no matter what. Now I see it means holding them accountable, too." He glanced at Darius, a look of respect in his eyes. "Thank you for showing me that." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Blake's words settling over them. Darius felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. In this quiet moment, he realized that the changes he had fought for weren't just policies or protocols, they were taking root in the people around him. As the program continued, Darius saw other officers slowly embracing the new approach, speaking out against biases, sharing experiences, and building a foundation of mutual respect. There were still those who resisted, but Darius knew that change wasn't about winning everyone over. It was about creating a culture that rewarded respect and integrity over power and fear. One evening, as Darius was preparing to leave, he ran into Captain Hardy, who looked at him with a warm smile. "I wanted you to know,
Warren," she said,
"that this program has already had more of an impact than I'd hoped. Officers are talking, questioning old ways, and starting to hold each other accountable." Darius felt a surge of gratitude, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you,
Captain, for believing in this."
for believing in me." She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "The credit is yours, Darius. You took the risk, stood your ground, and showed this department a different way forward." As he left the precinct that night, Darius felt a rare sense of peace. He knew the journey wasn't over, that the path would have more obstacles, but he was ready for them. He'd done something that mattered, something that would echo through the precinct long after the day was done. And for the first time, Darius felt that the badge he wore represented more than just authority. It represented a promise to do what was right, no matter how hard. The precinct had a different energy in the days that followed. Conversations that once halted at Darius's approach now continued openly. Officers who had kept him at a distance were coming forward, some with hesitant nods, others with genuine words of support. The mentorship program had become more than just a forced exercise. It was reshaping the way people viewed their work and each other. One morning, Darius arrived at the precinct to find Chief Montgomery waiting for him near the entrance, his expression one of quiet pride. The chief motioned for him to follow, leading him through the precinct halls that had once been charged with tension but now felt lighter, more unified. They stopped outside the main hall, where a group of officers from various precincts stood waiting, a few casting curious glances at Darius. Chief Montgomery cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention as he began to speak. "We're here today to recognize an officer who has challenged us to be better, to hold each other accountable, and to serve with integrity." His gaze landed on Darius, respect evident in his eyes. Officer Warren's actions have not only brought about change within this department, but have set an example of courage and conviction that every one of us can learn from. Darius felt a warmth rise in his chest, his heart pounding with a mix of humility and pride. The chief's words carried a weight that he hadn't expected, a validation that was rare in a career that often demanded so much and offered so little recognition. Chief Montgomery turned to address the gathered officers. "Because of Officer Warren's willingness to take a stand, we've introduced a mentorship program, a comprehensive bias training initiative, and a renewed commitment to the values we swore to uphold. This department is stronger because of his actions, and we're moving forward together." A ripple of applause broke out, hesitant at first, but growing louder, carrying with it a sincerity that Darius could feel. Several officers stepped forward to shake his hand, their expressions a mixture of gratitude and respect. Even Officer Paulson, who had once been one of his harshest critics, extended his hand, his eyes carrying a grudging admiration. "You did what most of us didn't have the courage to do," Paulson said, his voice quiet. "I might not have agreed with your methods, but I respect you." "Warren." Darius took Paulson's hand, giving it a firm shake. "Thank you, Paulson. I appreciate that." As the gathering dispersed, Captain Hardy approached, her face bright with a smile that held more pride than Darius had ever seen. "You did it, Darius," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You really did it." He shook his head, a smile breaking through his usual calm. "We did it,
Captain."
I couldn't have done this alone." She nodded, acknowledging his words.
"True.
"But you were the one who lit the fire. Don't ever forget that." The chief pulled Darius aside, his voice dropping to a more personal tone. "You know, Warren, change is one of the hardest things to bring to a department like ours. People resist it. They fear it. But you've shown that even the most ingrained attitudes can shift, that we can be better." Darius felt a swell of gratitude and responsibility. "Thank you,
Chief."
I'm committed to seeing this through, to making sure this isn't just a temporary change." Chief Montgomery nodded, his gaze steady. "And you have my full support, every step of the way." As they parted, Darius felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would still be challenges, moments of resistance, times when his faith would be tested, but he was ready for it. He'd seen the impact his actions could have, not just on his colleagues, but on the entire culture of the department. That evening, Darius left the precinct under a sky painted with the colors of a setting sun, the golden light casting long shadows on the street. He thought back to the beginning, to that day in the grocery store,
When he had made the choice to step in,
to confront Tom Langston's abuse of power. It had seemed like a small, isolated moment back then.
now,
He realized it had been the start of something far greater than he'd imagined. As he walked to his car, he saw Officer Blake standing by, waiting with a tentative smile. "Mind if I walk with you for a minute?" Blake asked, his voice a little hesitant. Darius nodded, gesturing for him to join. They walked in comfortable silence for a few moments before Blake finally spoke. "You know," Blake said, his tone thoughtful, "I always thought loyalty meant sticking with the people you started with. never questioning them. But watching you these past few months, I've learned that real loyalty means holding each other accountable. It means challenging each other to be better. Darius looked at him, pride swelling in his chest. That's exactly right,
Blake.
It's not about blind loyalty. It's about doing what's best for the people we serve and for each other. Blake gave a nod, his expression serious. Thank you for showing me that. And if you ever need support, if things get tough, just know I've got your back. Darius felt his resolve deepen, his sense of purpose crystallizing as they shook hands. It was officers like Blake, the ones willing to learn and grow, who gave him hope for the future. As Darius drove home, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He had faced doubt, hostility, and resistance, but he had also witnessed the power of perseverance, the strength of integrity. The precinct was changing, slowly but surely, and he was proud to be a part of that transformation. For the first time in his career, Darius felt truly at peace with the badge he wore. It wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a commitment, a promise to uphold the values that had guided him from the beginning. And he was ready to keep fighting for that promise, to keep building a department that lived up to its purpose. As he looked out at the road ahead, the lights of the city stretching into the distance, Darius felt a renewed determination. He didn't know what challenges the future would bring, but he knew one thing for certain. He would face them with courage, with conviction, and with an unwavering commitment to justice. And for Darius Warren, that was everything.